right, let's do this. Well, first and foremost, welcome everybody. I know I scheduled this for an hour. I honestly don't even know if it's going to go that long. But if it does, great. Hopefully, that means you all have lots of amazing questions to ask. On that note, a couple of just general ground rules to get us going. Please do keep yourself on mute unless you are asking a question. However, if you are asking a question, please ask it out loud for the good of the group. And then I don't have to try to interpret what it was that you typed. And also, I don't have to keep an eye on the chat box that way. And just for future reference, I will send this slide deck along with a link to the class recording to anybody who registered. If you haven't already subscribed or at least checked out my YouTube page, I would encourage you to do so. I do several of these WTF classes on a variety of forms, and some quite lengthy ones like the listing agreement and the purchase contract. But I also have really brief 60-second videos that are answering common contract questions, as well as posting my team meeting content and things like that. So it's just a good resource for you to have outside of your own brokers if you are not one of mine. So let's get this started with a poll because you all like questions at 9 o'clock in the morning. So just a couple for this first poll. True or false, when working with a buyer, the Reade agency, however you want to pronounce it, the acronym or whatever you want to call it, it's all the same document, form should be signed before viewing any homes. True or false, there are times when all three boxes of the election section should be checked. And true or false, the ready should be signed by an unrepresented buyer or seller. 10 more seconds to get your answer submitted. All right, let's see what we got. True or false, when working with a buyer, the ready form should be signed before viewing any homes. That is true. And we'll go through why that is. But in essence, that's because you need upfront permission to show listings from your same brokerage. So that should be signed simultaneously with the buyer broker agreement, whichever version you're using. And you will note on those buyer broker, whether it's the buyer broker exclusive employment or it's the buyer broker agreement to show, both of those actually reference that they are being used in conjunction with the agency disclosure and that ready form has been signed and acknowledged as well. So both of those documents should be signed prior to viewing any homes with a buyer. With a seller, it's pretty easy because you would just get all of your listing docs signed at the same time, I would assume anyway. True or false? There are times when all three boxes of the election section should be checked. Yeah, so a lot of you put true for this, and that is actually false. There are no circumstances in which all three boxes should be checked because one of them is contradictory to the others, and that is the one that actually ties into number 3. The ready form should be signed by an unrepresented buyer or seller. That is true. And that is true because there is just one box in each of those cases that we'll discuss where it specifies, hey, seller is aware that the broker represents only the buyer, or transversely, that the buyer is aware that the broker represents only the seller, depending on which party it is, of course. But many of you do mark all three boxes, and you shouldn't. If you have three boxes marked, there's a problem there. All right, let's get into the actual form itself. So the real estate agency disclosure and election form, it was most recently updated last November. And note on the top, and this obviously came in relation to the changes that we had from NAR last year and making some of those modifications, but just making sure that they understand that this document is not an employment agreement. This is exactly what it says that it is. It's a disclosure document. It is not an employment agreement. So just because a buyer or seller signs this form does not make them your client. And then the typical pre-printed portion of this, blah, 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 all of that usual trademarked copyrighted stuff up at the top. The firm name, broker, okay, whoever you are with, that brokerage name should be there. So for most of you, it'll be Realty One Group. Acting through. There are two lines on here in case you have a co-agent working with you. And if that is the case, both of you should be named. So if you have a team, for example, or a partnership of some sort, or you're just partnering up on a specific transaction, you would need both of those licensees' names at the top there online too. And they hereby make the following disclosure. Before a seller or landlord, hereinafter referred to as seller, or a buyer or tenant, so yes, this is used for everybody, hereinafter referred to as buyer, enters into a discussion with a real estate broker or licensee affiliated with a broker, the seller and the buyer should understand what type of agency relationship or representation they will have with the broker in the transaction. So this is really answering one of our poll questions, right? That, hey, before you do these things, before you enter into these discussions, certainly before you view a home, we need to have that agency discussion pretty quickly because of the importance of explaining why you may not be able to view Realty One Group listings or your exact same broker's listings. And then there's going to be the two segments for, well, three segments, including dual agency. So the first one, the buyer's broker. A broker other than the seller's broker can agree with the buyer to act as the broker for the buyer. Okay, just a very fancy way of saying, yes, you're a buyer's broker. In these situations, the buyer's broker is not representing the seller, even if the buyer's broker is receiving compensation for services rendered, either in full or in part from the seller or through the seller's broker. And that's been that way forever, right? Even before all of those changes, they were just doing that through the MLS where the compensation was being offered. So, in essence, we are potentially, depending on the circumstances, being compensated by the seller, but we do not have an agency. We do not represent the seller's interests in that situation if we are solely working as a buyer's broker. A buyer's broker has the fiduciary duties of loyalty, obedience, disclosure, confidentiality, and accounting in dealings with the buyer. All these things that we've learned about in the past, right? We know the little acronyms for dealing with our fiduciary duties. Other potential buyers represented by broker may consider, make offers on, or acquire an interest in the same or similar properties as buyer is seeking. It doesn't happen very often, but it has happened, especially if you work in very niche areas where you could have two or three buyers looking at the exact same property at the exact same time. And I'm have been asked in the past, well, what do I need signed by them in order to allow this? Well, if you did your job correctly, you had it signed up front. So this form has already, in essence, said, hey, this could happen. And they are acknowledging that that could happen. And there's nothing preventative that needs to be done in that case. Now, of course, you can't share confidential information or let the other buyers know, well, hey, one of my buyers offered 600,000 on this home. You can't do that because then you're breaching your fiduciary duties to the client who submitted the 600,000, okay? But you can certainly work with multiple buyers towards the same property. Seller's broker. A broker under a listing agreement with the seller acts as the broker for the seller only. A seller's broker has the fiduciary duties of loyalty, obedience, disclosure, confidentiality, and accounting and dealings with the seller. Other potential sellers represented by broker may list properties that are similar to the property that seller is selling. So, same sort of situation. I could have three listings on the same street that are the same floor plan. And ultimately, there is nothing that the seller can do to prevent that situation because they've already acknowledged that that could happen. And it's not just me, it's anyone, again, within my brokerage that could have that same thing. And where that gets a little dicey is the sellers get irritated because one of those other ones goes under contract and they want to know why it wasn't theirs. Okay. And depending on the circumstances and if you have permission to share, you can certainly do so. Sometimes it's clear one had a pool and the other two didn't, or something similar. But again, these are the things that are giving you permission in advance, getting that acknowledgement, letting the buyer or seller know these things could potentially happen. Questions on that initial disclosure part for buyer or seller? Okay. So here's the one that everybody dreads, and probably the biggest topic that we'll cover today. And it's broker representing both seller and buyer, also known as a limited representation broker, or most commonly referred to as dual agency. A broker either acting directly or through one or more licensees within the same brokerage firm can legally represent both the seller and the buyer in a transaction, but only with the knowledge and informed consent of both the seller and the buyer. In these situations, the broker, acting through its licensees, represents both the buyer and the seller with limitations of those duties owed to the buyer and seller. And then they're going to give you some specific examples. So, oftentimes, when agents are inquiring about what I can and cannot do in a limited representation or dual agency situation, this is a very brief, vague breakdown of what that actually means, but they tried to hit on the most critical component to this. The broker will not, without written authorization, because there is a form for that, disclose to the other party that the seller will accept a price or terms other than stated in the listing, or that the buyer will accept a price or terms other than offered. Pretty clear cut. Okay. We cannot disclose to the other side what they may or may not be willing to accept. All we can let them know is this is what the price and terms are that it's listed for. And on this opposite side with the buyer, we cannot tell the seller what we think the buyer is willing to pay in that situation. There will be conflicts in the duties of loyalty, obedience, disclosure, and confidentiality. Disclosure of confidential information may be made only with written authorization. Okay, and you can use for both of those situations where it's referring to written authorization, that could be as simple as a Word document. Um, they could potentially have that written into their listing agreement or their buyer broker agreement. They could have that on a completely separate addendum to either of those employment agreements, but just an email or a Word document would be sufficient to deliver that notice. Regardless of who the broker represents in the transaction, the broker shall exercise reasonable skill and care in the performance of the broker's duties and shall be truthful and honest. That's kind of funny. Is there a difference between being truthful and honest? I'm this English major is going to have to look this up because I feel like those are synonymous, but there's obviously a reason that they put both in there. To both the buyer and seller, and shall disclose all known facts which materially and adversely affect the consideration to be paid by any party. Pursuant to ARS 3225 or 2156, sellers, lessors, and brokers are not obligated to disclose that a property is or has been the site of a natural death, suicide, homicide, or any crime classified as a felony. But ironically enough, you do have to disclose misdemeanors. What the heck? What in the heckity heck? I don't even know sometimes. There was a funny example. I'm going to go off topic for a second because it's a funny example that AAR, I'm pretty sure it was Legal Hotline, had released, and this was several years ago, that there was a situation where some kids came in and were skinny dipping in a pool that did not belong to them. And it was a misdemeanor, it wasn't a felony. But that seller had to disclose that misdemeanor on their spuds for the kids who came in and entered their yard and went skinny dipping in their pool while they were out of town. So, just a little heads up, now you know what the difference is. Owner or occupied by or owned or occupied by a person exposed to HIV or diagnosed as having AIDS or any other disease not known to be transmitted through common occupancy of real estate or located in the vicinity of a sex offender. Sellers or sellers' representatives may not treat the existence, terms, or conditions of offers as confidential unless there is a confidentiality agreement between the parties. That little line says so much. So very often, and it's gotten a little better, but back in the day, we would have a multiple offer situation. And the listing agent would inevitably say, I cannot disclose the terms of the other offers. And that's actually not true. So, unless you have written instructions to the contrary, you can, in fact, disclose the offers that are on the table with one exception. If you or another agent within your brokerage have a buyer in that equation, so they are one of the multiple offers, then you cannot shop offers. Okay, because that's potentially detrimental. That is considered confidential information to that party. And because you cannot disclose that, the only thing you can say to all other parties in that case is, I can't disclose that information. Please submit your highest and best. If you do not personally have a buyer, or if someone within your brokerage does not have a buyer in that multiple offer situation, however, you can absolutely say, my highest offer is for $625,000. They're getting a conventional loan. They're putting 15% down. They're asking for a 1% concession, and they want a $700 home warranty. You can shop those offers all day long. So just remember that the caveat to that is if any of those, and I know we're all like, oh, multiple offers, that would be wonderful in this market. They could happen, you never know. So just make sure that you understand that that's the one little catch to that is if you do, or if in our case, Realty One Group, but your brokerage also has a buyer, then you cannot shop those offers. You just ask for highest and best. I'm snarky. So if I am representing a buyer and the listing agent gives me that canned response that, well, I'm not able to disclose that, I'm going to ask them, do you have written instructions from your seller that you are not able to disclose that information? And then they'll fumble around and be like, well, no, but I just can't do that. And then I point them to this, and then there's a line in the ER as well that it is actually their duty to shop offers in an effort to get the highest and best offer for their client. And unless they have written instructions to the contrary, I would like them to tell me what the terms of those existing offers are. You'll make a ton of friends in real estate when you start actually quoting the documents that we utilize. All right, big, bold, capital letters. The duties of the broker in a real estate transaction do not relieve the seller or the buyer from the responsibility to protect their own interests. The seller and the buyer should carefully read all agreements to ensure that the documents adequately express their understanding of the transaction. I've put down at the bottom here a couple of very quick little snippet scripts to consider in a dual agency transaction because, again, I think we're more concerned about it than I don't want to say than we should be. There are definitely causes for concern with dual agency, but I think you can become really adept at handling them if you understand your role and what you can and cannot do. One of my favorite little phrases that I've heard in the past is in a dual agency transaction, I become a referee instead of a coach. And I think that does a pretty good job of explaining my role. But I want them, again, that's kind of vague, right? It's a little ambiguous. Well, what does that actually mean? Really, what it boils down to is I cannot give you my opinion. I cannot give you my opinion, or if I'm in receipt or am knowledgeable about confidential information that could be favorable to you, even if I know that, I can't disclose it because I equally have fiduciary duties to the other party. But what I can do is I can give you facts, figures, and probable outcomes to make an educated decision. When I am talking to my agents about dual agency transactions, I just kind of throw it out there that I am somebody who recommends that you always operate in such a way, meaning that your opinion is not as valuable as you think it is, or quite frankly, even as valuable as your client thinks it is. They want you to be the source of information so that they can make a decision. Your opinion doesn't matter if you can provide the facts and let them know in a situation like this is what happens. These are all of the recent sales in the community. You can see that this is the average. These are the individual sales. These are the properties that had pools. These did not. These are how long these properties were on the market. This is what they had for concessions. Now, if somebody has all of that information at their disposal, they are more likely to be able to make a decision on their own. I'm also someone who has been very hesitant to ever tell a client, this is what I think you should do. Because God forbid that backfires. And the only person responsible now is me because I told them this is what I think you should do. And I think we've gotten into the habit of wanting to be helpers. And somehow we think that that's how we should operate instead of really working to help our clients arrive at the conclusion that is best for them. And again, that's just being a source of information for them. Questions before I move on to the next part? Okay, so we've very briefly explained agency and our respective roles, and then we've gone ahead and we've made the disclosure of this is what these things mean. And now we get to the actual election part. Agency election does not establish broker compensation. Again, that was a modification that was made after the NAR rules passed last year. Compensation paid by a buyer or seller to their broker is not set by law, is always fully negotiable, and the amount chosen shall be documented in a separate written employment agreement after discussion with their broker. Should a seller also choose to offer compensation to a buyer's broker, the offered amount is also not set by law, is fully negotiable, and agreed upon after discussion with seller's broker. This clause is appearing in a lot of our documents. You may recognize it, and it's just another little option, a little opportunity to make sure that the buyer and seller is fully aware of what compensation looks like, how we work it now, and that they're acknowledging that it's fully negotiable. And then we get to those check boxes. So remember, I said there are no circumstances where you will mark all three. So I'll discuss that as we go here. But the first section is you have the buyer. Just a quick note, if your buyer is also your seller, okay, meaning that they're doing both transactions with you simultaneously, they need to sign two separate agency forms, one for their buyer election and one for their seller election. You cannot use the same agency form for both transactions, even if it's the same client. So please make sure you have that separated. Buyer or tenant election. Complete the section only if you are the buyer. The undersigned elects to have the broker, check any that apply, represent the buyer as buyer's broker. That is always, always, always going to be marked for a buyer if you represent the buyer. Always. Represent the seller as seller's broker. The only time line 49 will be marked is if you have an unrepresented buyer. Okay, so they are signing this form along with the unrepresented buyer disclosure. That is the only time you will have line 49 checked. Line 50 is the dual agency permission. Show buyer properties listed with broker's firm, and buyer agrees that broker shall act as an agent for both buyer and seller, provided that the seller consents to limited representation. In the event of a purchase, buyers and sellers' informed consent should be acknowledged in a separate writing other than the purchase contract. And that's the form we're going to get to next. That's the consent to limited representation. This is why we said you have to have this signed before you show any properties, because you need their permission to show them properties that are listed by the same brokerage. They have to understand what the limitations are with that. They need to have agency fully explained to them. And only if they agree to enter into a limited agency or limited representation situation will you then mark box 50. So 48 and 50 are very commonly checked. I don't know how often that agency conversation is taking place in advance of checking line 50, but this should all be done up front. Because if the buyer or the seller, as we'll get to next, tells you, no, I am not okay with that limited representation, you only represent me, then what does that mean? We can't look at any of those homes listed by the same brokerage. So we have to weed all of those out. Now, especially to a buyer, what I would let them, well, honestly, to both parties, what I would let them know is, in our case, Realty One Group, we have almost 3,000 agents in Maricopa County. We're not even the largest firm in Maricopa County. We have mega brokerages in Arizona, and it is very, very unlikely that there will not be at least one home shown from within the same brokerage. And if you decide that you are not okay with limited representation, unfortunately, that means that the home you could really like, could check all your boxes and really fit your criteria, you're going to bypass that because of the concern with limited representation. And I'm not going to push them to make that decision, I just want them to be aware of the pros and cons of saying yay or nay to limited representation. And that's why we need to have that conversation up front. And that's why they need to check the box accordingly if they are okay with it. Same things for the seller or landlord election. Complete the section only if you are the seller. The undersigned elects to have the broker represent the buyer as buyer's broker. The only time that will be checked is if we have an unrepresented seller. Okay, there is also a separate document, the unrepresented seller compensation agreement, that goes into this in a little more detail. And if you utilize that, you wouldn't need to utilize the seller compensation agreement, just as a heads up. So that form has been in existence for a while because we would use it with FSBOs. But you will not check that unless we have an unrepresented seller. Represent the seller as seller's broker. Okay, that's the most common one. Of course, if we have the seller, we are going to mark that box. And then the same thing, show seller's property to buyers represented by broker's firm, and seller agrees that broker shall act as agent for both seller and buyer, provided that buyer consents to the limited representation. In the event of a purchase, buyers and sellers' informed consent should be acknowledged in a separate writing other than the purchase contract. This is how I know that this conversation is unlikely being had appropriately with our clients. The buyers are a little harder to tell because we don't have anything to memorialize that's accessible to the public or to each other. In all of my years, and I've been doing this for a minute, I have never once seen a disclosure in the semi-private remarks or private remarks of the MLS that says, hey, other Realty One Group agents, other My Home Group, other EXP, other HomeSmart, whatever that is. I've never seen one that says, do not show this home, or that client is not willing, seller is not willing to enter into a limited representation transaction. I have never seen that notice or alert go into the MLS. And quite frankly, if you have a seller that has said, no, absolutely not, you will only represent me, then that disclosure should be in the MLS, because that means I'm not going to show your listing. I can't. You've told me that that's not going to be an option. So again, I don't know that this conversation is being had the way that it needs to be had, and maybe not at the right times. But in advance of doing anything and making sure we're explaining what those limitations are is the name of the game. More often than not, and we'll see what transpires with this over time, but we have a lot of claims that come in related to dual agency. And almost always it's because it wasn't appropriately shared with them or disclosed to them what that entailed. And then the bottom portion, the undersigned buyers or sellers acknowledge that this document is a disclosure of duties. Again, it's just a disclosure and election document. It is not an employment agreement. And then they're going to acknowledge a receipt of a copy of this and print and sign below. I think I saw something in the chat. Oh, yes. Any questions about the agency disclosure? Who wants to volunteer if they've ever inadvertently violated their agency, not realizing exactly what it entailed? I will tell you more often than not, where I see it is that the buyer's agent and selling agent, listing agent, are at the same brokerage, and they don't understand that the dual agency rules apply whether they personally are representing both or two agents under the same DB are representing both. So I see that quite frequently. One of the first questions I have to ask in really any time an agent asks me about what they should do, I have to ask, is the other party represented by Realty One Group? Because the response might be modified and it might be, we can't tell them what they can do in this situation. And again, we'll go through a couple of pretty specific examples for that. All right, so moving on to the consent for limited representation. Let me go ahead and launch another poll for you. All right, true or false? I should have the consent to limited representation signed at the same time as the ready or agency disclosure. True or false? Dual agency exists if any two agents under the same designated broker represent the buyer and seller. True or false? In a dual agency situation, I may provide comps to the buyer. True or false? In a dual agency situation, I may tell the buyer what repair items they should request on the Binzer. True or false? In a dual agency situation, if I am aware that the seller is getting divorced and is willing to accept 20,000 less for their home, I am able to share this information with the buyer. I know there's a few more there, so I'll give you a little extra time. 10 seconds. All right, true or false? I should have the consent to limited representation signed at the same time as the ready form. Unless there's a really unique circumstance in which you already know that you have both parties in the transaction, the answer to that is false. You actually wouldn't be able to have that signed because you don't have the details of that future transaction yet. You don't know if it's going to be limited representation when you're getting the agency signed because the agency is signed right up front before you do anything. The consent is going to be signed at time of offer. Dual agency exists if any two agents under the same designated broker represent the buyer and the seller. As we discussed during the last segment, that is true. Okay, it's not just for a single agent. This is for any agents under the same designated broker. On that note, feel free to join me in my crusade against this, especially in Arizona. Currently, it's actually statutory protections that have this in place. However, there are many states that have what we refer to as designated agency. And if we implement designated agency in Arizona, we actually would not have to worry about dual agency under the same designated broker. It would only be if it's a single agent. So if you're with me on that, let me know because I will be working on my petition to try to have Congress in Arizona, our Senate and House, update that accordingly. That's a work in progress. True or false? In a dual agency situation, I may provide comps to the buyer. That's true. You can provide comps. What you can't do is, in essence, cherry pick those comps or tell them, hey, based on this, this is what I think you should offer. But the actual providing of comps is not a problem. True or false? In a dual agency situation, I may tell the buyer what repair items they should request on the Binzer. That is false. Good job. Everybody got that one correct. That one's a little easier, I think, right? Even it's separate from price, because who could they refer to or who could they chat about what repair requests they should request? The inspector would probably be a good one. I mean, at the end of the day, they see a lot of homes. And again, I always encourage my buyer, hey, let's do that recap. Let's check with the inspector and ask them what's abnormal. What if this was a home you were buying, home inspector? What would you ask the sellers to repair? They could also get bids for repairing items and then request a credit if they wish to do that. So they have other resources that make that part much easier. True or false? In a dual agency situation, if I am aware that the seller is getting divorced and is willing to accept 20,000 less for their home, I am able to share this information with the buyer. True, false, or it depends. Did a lot of you just mark it depends because that was a new response and you figured, well, it must be right if ultimately we haven't had that option before? Or can somebody unmute themselves and tell me what does it depend on?
In my opinion, it depends if you have the written authorization to
Mhm.
disclose.
That is correct. Gold star, Katya. That's exactly what it is. That ultimately, if you're in a position where the seller has said, hey, if any buyers come along, you can let them know that, yes, we're in the midst of a divorce and we're willing to accept this instead. Now, why they wouldn't just reduce the price of their home on the MLS, I don't know. But if you have that written permission, by all means, you can absolutely go ahead and share that. All right, so the consent to limited representation form, the CLR, it used to be the consent to limited dual representation. It's all the same thing. But this is reiterating that broker represents both seller and buyer or both landlord and tenant. And this was also updated in 2024. So make sure you have the right one. The fill in the blanks, the buyer, the seller, the property address, and the firm name. So whoever your broker is. And then consent. So buyer and seller consent that broker acting through the licensees named below will represent both parties in the transaction. So if it's me, myself, and I representing both parties, then my name is going to go on line 6. However, if it's me and Linda, then we're going to go ahead and we're going to have our names on the corresponding lines there on 7 and 8. So if I have been representing the buyer, my name will go on line 7. And if Linda has the seller, then her name's going to go on line 8. Duties and limitations. This is really just going to reiterate what they were told, ideally at the onset, but now we're getting them to buy into it in written confirmation. The broker now represents both buyer and seller, and both parties understand that neither broker nor broker's licensees can represent the interests of one party to the exclusion or detriment of the other party. The parties understand and further consent to the following. The licensee or each licensee represents both the buyer and the seller with limitations of the duties owed to the buyer and the seller, such as the licensees will not, without written authorization, disclose to the other party that the seller will accept a price or terms other than stated in the listing, or that the buyer will accept a price or terms other than offered. That's the easy one, right? I think we're all very clear on that. There will be conflicts in the duties of loyalty, obedience, disclosure, and confidentiality. Disclosure of confidential information may be made only with written authorization. This does not relieve each licensee of any legal obligation to disclose all known facts, which may materially and adversely affect the consideration to be paid by any party to the transaction. And that exists no matter what, okay? That's part of our purchase contract terms. That, hey, if we are aware of information that can negatively impact this transaction, we have to disclose that to the other side. And that is not eliminated in this situation. Pursuant to ARS 322156, sellers, lessors, and broker licensees are not obligated to disclose that the subject property is or has been the site of a natural death, suicide, homicide, or any crime classified as a felony, but misdemeanors are okay, owned or occupied by a person exposed to HIV or diagnosed as having AIDS or any other disease not known to be transmitted through common occupancy of real estate, or located in the vicinity of a sex offender. The licensees shall exercise reasonable skill and care in the performance of their duties. The licensees shall be obligated at all times to deal honestly with all parties. And the duties of the licensees in this transaction do not relieve the seller or the buyer from the responsibility to protect their own interests. So, almost verbatim, this form is reiterating what they had initially agreed to, but now it's real. Okay, it's not a hypothetical, this could happen. We actually know, and that's why we didn't have this form in advance. We actually know that it's happening now, and we need both the buyer and seller to buy into this again. This form needs to be presented at time of offer, along with the two checkboxes on the purchase contract, 450 and 464, stating that the broker represents both the buyer and seller. Okay, so anytime we have a limited representation or a dual agency situation, there's 3 things that we must have. We must have that initial agency disclosure signed, acknowledging the appropriate boxes that they agree in advance to dual agency. We need this consent to limited representation signed, and we need lines 450 and 464 of the PC checked, both buyer and seller. Those are the 3 critical components to getting this written authorization. Compensation to the broker is not set by law, is fully negotiable and should be paid pursuant to separate agreements. Okay, whether it's your ER, your seller compensation, your buyer broker, all of those are compensation agreements. Seller and buyer understand this consent does not replace prior agreements entered into with broker, and such agreement shall remain in effect. However, to the extent that the terms of this consent contradict or conflict with the terms of prior agreements, this consent shall supersede. Okay, so there are certain things in your buyer broker agreement and your listing contract that spell out your duties. And now we're letting them know there could, and there is, some conflicting information, and that this is going to supersede what those previous agreements state as far as what our duties and what we can do for our buyer or seller. If the seller and buyer do not enter into a contract relating to the subject property, or if the transaction between the seller and the buyer fails to close, the parties agree that this consent is terminated, and the party shall have no further rights or obligations pursuant to this consent. Okay, it is a case by case, transaction by transaction basis. It's not a universal consent. So, meaning that the buyer or seller, after this situation, depending on how it went, they may decide, no, I no longer want to have a dual agency option, and that I want to have that removed. I don't want to enter into that again. Seller and buyer agree to indemnify and hold broker harmless against any and all claims, damages, losses, expenses, or liabilities, including attorney's fees and costs incurred by broker in any defense thereof arising from broker's role of limited representation. I mean, it's nice that it's in there. How practical that actually is, or the likelihood of us being indemnified in a situation like that is slim to none. But we put it in there to try to protect ourselves. The undersigned parties acknowledge that they have thoroughly read, understood, and approved this consent and acknowledge receipt of a copy. And same thing, they're going to go ahead and sign then. Okay, how, give an example, is the client representation limited if two different licensees are assisting each client individually but are under the same brokerage umbrella? Is the client representation limited if two? Because we consider that the same level of dual agency. So if I'm understanding, and Christina, feel free to unmute yourself or come in. I think you're still in the bullpen. So, meaning that in essence, your duties under a dual agency transaction, they are identical, whether you are a single agent or you're two agents. There's no difference as far as limited representation goes.
But I can advise the client and share my opinion, given that I represent them only and a different licensee is representing the other party.
Incorrect. Not if that other licensee is also with Realty One Group.
So how would either party then know, each client's bottom lines or,
They won't.
oh, but so we're just not allowed. If we share the brokerage, even though they have no way of knowing, and we still can't give them our opinion.
That is correct.
Oh,
Yep. So, and this is why I'm saying that this is the most misunderstood component to dual agency in Arizona, especially for agents who came from other states. Because what I was referring to with designated agency, if we had designated agency in Arizona, this situation would not exist. It wouldn't be a problem because you would be able to represent just your client in that situation. But in Arizona, with the way that dual agency exists, yeah, it is no different than you representing both the buyer and the seller.
oh, huh. Well, that sucks.
I love the tone of that. Oh, yeah, that's usually what I hear when agents start to understand. Oh shit. And when I was kind of saying it tongue in cheek, like, okay, who wants to admit that they've probably violated it?
Yeah, in that case, I have.
Don't,
One time last
recorded
year.
and posted publicly. Don't give too much information. Oh, okay. So yeah, now thank you for clarifying that. That just making sure everybody understands. Katya.
Quick question. Let's say that they did go under contract under dual agency and then it falls through and they don't want to be represented in a dual agency scenario again. Do you have to redo read form?
Reade, ready, agency, whatever that document is called. Yes. Yeah. You could do this one of two ways. You could modify the existing document, but quite frankly, no, I would just get an updated agency form signed.
You got it. Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, Brian, should we allow our brokerage agents show and write an offer even if our seller does not want dual agency? Nope. No, I get where you're going with the second part of that. If the seller likes the offer, they could amend, correct? It's too late after that fact because we're already in violation of agency if in essence we didn't establish that up front. So this isn't a retroactive application of this. That's why it's so critical to have that conversation and really explain to them this is the potential overall detriment to you if you do not allow this. I have to put in the MLS. that the other 3,000 Realty One Group agents cannot show your home. And what do you think happens when you're talking about some of, like I said, we've got a lot of very large brokerages, and you really want to rule that out because my opinion is so important to you. Um, and that's why I also think it's critical to make sure they understand this is what I can do. And it really is just my opinion that you're avoiding in this case. But if you have all of that information to help you come to a decision, do you really care what I think you should accept for your property? I would love it if all of my sellers cared what I thought they should accept. I'd be selling homes left and right at the end of the day. They don't. So at the end of the day, they know what they're pretty much willing to accept, or based on net sheets, they know what they're willing to walk away with. And they would still get all of those things. They're not going to have that off the table. So honestly, I think this is a little easier for sellers than it is for buyers personally. But at the end of the day, they both have to buy into it. Gotcha.
Sorry.
No, you're fine.
If you were to summarize both forms, let's say in one long sentence, how would you summarize each?
Yeah, this is in essence me telling you, the buyer or seller, what I can and cannot do as far as my agency relationship with you.
And what about with a little more friendly
I don't do
verbiage?
friendly. Katya, you know me. I am straight and to the point, and you're either going to take it or you're not. No, I think that the problem is the friendlier you become, the message becomes more muddy because you're trying to soften the blow, so to speak. And some things don't need to be softened, they need to be clear as day. And in my opinion, this is one of them.
Got it.
Brian says, Chat GPT, make it friendly. Anybody else? Okay, well, now that I have all of you freaking out about what you may or may not have done wrong in the past, you know the proper procedure going forward. Like I said, I will send this out to everybody, but if you do think of other questions, you can always reach out and let me know. And on
Thank
that,
you, Leah.
I'll let you go. My pleasure. Have a great day, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.